The death of a baby is an extremely traumatic event which impacts on both parents and the wider family for many years, if not forever. And it's not something that can simply be got over. It's an event that families and individuals simply learn to live with. The burial of a child is also a very traumatic, but it can, for many bereaved parents and their families, form a very important part of the grieving process. And yet, it was only in the mid to late 1980s that the death of a baby was truly starting to be recognised as a major bereavement. Until then, as we've heard some members today mention, any baby who died before birth, regardless of the gestation period, was swiftly removed from the labour ward, and parents were not given an opportunity to see or hold their baby. Some mothers were sedated after the birth because it was thought that this would help them forget, and it was a generally held view amongst professionals and indeed society that parents should forget their babies and it was best to carry on as though nothing had happened, and grieving was actively discouraged. Stillbirth truly was a huge taboo, and gradually now we are starting to break down that taboo and deal with these matters with more compassion and more sensitivity. And I very much agree with the point made by the Honourable Member for South Deepings in the Hollands regarding the roles of fathers in these kind of events. Because until fairly recently, fathers of babies who died before birth were pretty much ignored, and the father's role was considered to be one of merely supporting his wife or partner in her attempts to forget about the lost child and to have another child as quickly as possible. And it's genuinely hard to believe that as a society, this was how we dealt with stillbirth until fairly recently. Some parents didn't even give their baby a name because they weren't advised that they could or should do so. Some didn't even know the gender of their baby, and some had no idea, many had no idea of what happened to their child's body. And as a result, the grief felt at this traumatic life event was silenced, frowned upon, leading to unnecessary isolation, family breakdowns and poor mental health. And it's down in great part to charitable groups like SANS and the work that they did that these appalling practices and attitudes, which these days is quite hard to believe, began to change. But recent years have taught us that although things are better these days, there can be no room for complacency. Recent years have shown us that there are very, very different practices on baby cremations across the UK, with some parents receiving ashes from some crematoria, but not for others, and that the availability of ashes after the cremations seems to have depended on things like the equipment and cremation techniques used and/or how the relevant authority defined ashes. And it seems there was no statutory definition of ashes in the UK. But this has now been rectified in legislation, and we've had similar legislation to the legislation the Minister referred to. We've had similar legislation in the Scottish Parliament. There's also the issue of parents being told that no ashes would be recovered, where in fact there were ashes which were sometimes disposed of without the parents' knowledge. Indeed, such practices led to investigations in Scotland going back some decades at Morton Hall Crematorium in Edinburgh. The investigation and the Infant Cremation Commission report and the report of the National Cremation Investigation led to positive change, and now in almost every circumstance, parents should receive the ashes from their baby's cremation, and a code of practice has been established by a National Committee on Infant Cremation, setting out key principles and minimum standards for all organisations conducting infant cremations. In March 2015, the Scottish Government announced the appointment of an Inspector of Crematoria for Scotland to ensure that all crematoria were adhering to the current legislation and best practice following the national investigation into circumstances surrounding historic infant cremation practices in Scotland. A criminal sanction was introduced to prohibit the cremation of a fetus or stillborn baby or infant with an unrelated person. Indeed, legislation was brought forward to overhaul policy and practice in the burial and cremation sector, with improved staff training. But we also know that up until fairly recently, the parents of stillborn children were never told where or how their baby had been buried. And to us today, this seems almost too cruel to be true and utterly beyond comprehension. Now, I had a stillbirth at full term, and I cannot imagine a situation where my baby would have been removed from me with no information about how or where he was buried. And that must, for the parents affected, it must have made the grieving process much more difficult, much more traumatic. We know that some parents who endured this decades ago can perhaps trace their baby's grave now, but it really is something they should never have to do. But yet, it's probably worse if these parents who seek to trace their child's remains simply cannot find where they are. Imagine the years passing and the questions growing in your head about where your baby is. I can scarcely believe the attitudes of the recent past that thought this was an appropriate way to deal with the lost babies and grieving parents and families. We know that some of the babies were buried with other babies, or sometimes with other random adults who had recently died in hospital. Parents now trying to trace the burial place of their babies years later are therefore not always successful in doing so, simply adding to the torture and pain despite the passing of years. But what is clear, everything that can be done must be done to assist the parents looking for their lost babies. These parents weren't usually informed that their baby's loss was officially documented and they could obtain a certification of their baby's stillbirth. Such certification can bring some comfort because it's an acknowledgement, a recognition that your baby existed. Most did not even know that they could name their baby. Patients in all circumstances were kept in the dark for their own protection. It was assumed that if a mother or father was allowed to see their stillborn baby and establish any kind of connection, that it would only prolong their grief. But of course, we know that parents are committed and connected to their children long before their birth, perhaps the point of conception, or perhaps even earlier, when they imagine themselves as parents for the first time. We recognise that to lose a baby at any point in pregnancy can be profoundly traumatic. Today, parents are encouraged to see, hold, or even dress their baby, their stillborn baby, if they choose to. They can take photographs, handprints, footprints, a lock of hair. They're encouraged to collect mementos of the baby and grieve for them as any parent would grieve for a child, no matter how long their life was. To know that so very many couples and families have been denied that chance is heartbreaking and, frankly, difficult to comprehend. Parents who lost babies decades ago still speak of the terrible guilt they feel about not knowing anything about what happened to their baby or where they're buried. But sadly, they had very little choice in these matters, as still in the fresh bewilderment of their grief, their babies were simply taken from them and nothing more was said. And it's hard to believe that in the 60s and 70s this was, if not mandatory, certainly extremely commonplace. But it sounds as though it was something that would have happened hundreds of years ago. We are more informed and more enlightened about these matters now, thankfully, and I hope that the relevant authorities in all parts of the UK will do all they can and continue to do all they can to help such affected parents to find out where their babies are and give them the support they need. And I know that SANS has done some excellent work in this area. Finding your baby's resting place will surely provide some peace for many of the bereaved parents and their families. Peace which is much needed and to which these parents and their wider family members are entitled. Thankfully, we all now recognise the huge and traumatic event that having a baby that is stillborn is, and how it casts a lifelong shadow over parents and wider family members as they cope with the absent presence of a child. Whether it's cremation practices or burials, all parents must be given the respect, their babies must be given the dignity of a burial or cremation that involves their families and provides a ritual that can be so important when grappling with overwhelming grief. We are doing things better now, but we must not be complacent on this issue, which is hugely significant for the families and parents left behind. It's right that this very important debate has taken place, and I want again to applaud the Honourable Member for Swansea East for securing it.